So today's workshop is Students with Disabilities and Career and Technical Education Programs. And I'm really glad to be introducing you today to John Spinney, who is the Postsecondary Transition Coordinator at the Vermont Agency of Education. John is in his 20th year at the AOE, where he works to support systems that promote good transitions to post-school life for students with disabilities across the state. John actually has the lived experience of having two younger brothers who were adopted as infants and both have Down syndrome. So he grew up being immersed in the disability world, and he is now the legal guardian for those two brothers who are in their 40s. So we'd like to welcome John and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, Krista. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh. As Krista mentioned, I work at the Agency of Education, and I'm highly involved in really all aspects of transition planning around the state. Of course, as a state agency, we serve the public school system, but we also interface with the independent schools as well. And so sometimes get pulled into those situations. That one thing to remember is that the very nature of transition is an interagency activity in a sense, because, while that student is in high school and moving closer to graduation, if they have a disability, they're often going to be connected to some other agencies and other community partners and folks like Vermont Family Network, folks like Higher Ability or State Level Developmental Services or VSAC. And so the nature of transition is interagency. So my point is, I work with a lot of folks at the state level who work in different aspects of education, human services, and disability. So it's not just the education aspect. There are other layers to it in terms of the work I'm doing. But anyway, you can kind of think of what I do as I'm on the special education team, and then I'm also very connected to the monitoring team. So we collect, we monitor Vermont's high schools on a cycle, and we do review those transition plans in the IEP where they are held to a certain standard in terms of compliance with special ed law. So let's get into this. Today, what we're going to cover is we're going to go over the existing best practices around CTE and the process for a student who's on an IEP. We're going to go over what are some of the most common pitfalls that we see around the state. We're also going to talk about the IEP transition plan and how that should be aligned with CTE or work-based learning or job shadowing or any other type of training program. The IEP is designed to develop those critical skills. We're also going to talk about some noteworthy programs outside of CTE that support transition skills. And we're going to cover, like I said, the IEP aspect and then a wish list for future programs. So just so folks know, nothing has changed with the system yet. Okay, we don't have a separate different pathway or anything like that yet for CTE. So you have a student who's on an IEP and they're interested in the CTE program. It's very important for parents and school staff to remember that the CTE admissions process in some ways is like college, because just around this aspect, because the students are not required to disclose whether or not they have a disability. And in light of that, that presents some additional tasks that the IEP team needs to do before the student applies. This is very important, and this is something that a lot of folks around the state are not always sort of executing this process. And if the IEP team doesn't go through this process, prior to the application, it presents problems down the road that we'll touch on that. So it's very important that the IEP team understands the rigor of the CTE program that the student is interested in. Not just the day-to-day rigor, but also information about the potential industry credentialing process and what things can be accommodated, not modified. It's very important to understand that CTE and industry credentialing programs typically do not have modifications like we see in the special education world. But CTE can do reasonable accommodations. IEP teams should also consider if the student will need any supports to meet any of the ongoing course requirements for that CTE program. For example, sometimes I hear these situations where a student is maybe in their second year of CTE and it looks like they might not be able to continue because they're having a hard time with some of these other course requirements. So that seems like something that if the IEP team and the sending school and the CTE center all put their heads together, what can we do to provide supports for those other courses? And think through this. And anything you can do up front around this work prior to the application is going to be helpful. Um, so is there any flexibility in what credentials are required or any chances to extend the timing for achieving the credential? So that's another critical question that the IEP team should try to work through. So, like I said, it's very critical that the IEP team understands this. Will the student be successful, as an IEP team and thinking through this, will the student be successful in this CTE program, or is it possibly a stretch that will push our student beyond their limits and not be successful or safe for them? These are considerations that the IEP team needs to think through. Does the CTE program align with the student's post-secondary goals in their IEP? Those are those goals that are like outcomes that take place after graduation. So what are the career-related, industry-related areas that the student is interested in based on transition assessment? So does the CTE program align with that? Is the CTE program going to help that student build those skills? It's especially heartbreaking for the student if they have to be removed after the program starts due to safety or some other reason that that the team couldn't really think through or didn't have enough information. Safety is usually the most critical one. This should be prevented at all costs. That is why this early process is so critical. So how does the IEP team figure this out? Okay, if there's one thing you take away from me on this, it's the special needs coordinator. They are absolutely critical. They are amazing. Every single CTE center in Vermont has a special needs coordinator, and they love their jobs. Most of them are former special educators, and then they went and got the special needs coordinator endorsement, which is a different endorsement than the special educator endorsement. Okay. But like I said, most of those folks used to be special educators. They love their job. I always hear that part of the reason they love their job is they have less paperwork than special educators, and they really get to work with students on developing their skills and working through their courses. And once a student is accepted, that special needs coordinator becomes the liaison between the sending high school IEP team and the CTE center. They effectively become a part of the IEP team during that time that the student is accepted and enrolled in the CTE center. So prior to the student applying, this is like the really key process that the IEP team can reach out to that special needs coordinator and ask for a meeting. And this meeting is best done remotely or by phone because the IEP team should not disclose the name of the student or any identifiable info yet at this stage because this keeps the admissions process blind of any disability. Remember what I said, that the CTE Center admissions process, they don't always know, they don't know typically if the student has a disability or not, or what any additional supports or needs that the student is going to need just based on that. So this is why having the IEP team do some of this work up front before the application is critical. So the IEP team can be asking the special needs coordinator questions about that day-to-day rigor and expectations of the CTE program. Additionally, the special needs coordinator can answer questions about the industry credentialing and the testing and what an accommodation might look like. And also that question around, is there any ability for that particular industry credential to have a different timeline? Like, is there a way to have more time for that student to meet that? Those are the questions you can be asking the special needs coordinator, because each of the industry credentials are different and have different timing. And the special needs coordinators are the experts in all of that, and that's a big part of their job, is to help the sending school IEP teams understand this. In other words, the IEP team needs to fully understand the program so they can endorse or not endorse the student applying to CTE. So here are our special needs coordinators statewide. After this presentation, I'll be giving the slide deck to Vermont Family Network, and then they will be sending this out. But these are the actual email links. So if an IEP team wants to start that early process, if they do have a student that's interested in CTE and has not yet applied, these folks are going to be your resource. These are your biggest asset in terms of understanding what you need to understand to make an educated decision about the appropriateness of that student applying to CTE. So this is a document that might be a little hard to see. Like I said, the slide deck will go out. This basically what this decision tree is doing is, if you look over here at the number 1, I'll kind of just walk you through it. The CTE Center develops their admissions criteria, their academic requirements, and provides them to the sending school counselors. The CTE Center conducts promotional activities in general for the sending schools. What a lot of centers nowadays do is they have their website, and they'll have the program requirements listed out. And that's very helpful as well for the IEP team to review those. And that's actually what step 3 is, that the sending school IEP team members are reviewing those things. And like I said, the IEP team should discuss and meet before this application process and decide if this is going to work, and what are some of the things that might be a potential issue that we need to consider and try to figure out a system for that. So sometimes, like I said, if there, for example, let's say there's some other courses that are required that potentially could trip up your student in a sense and jeopardize their placement. Well, what can we do around that? Those are sometimes not courses that might not even be a part of CTE necessarily, but they're a required course. So what supports does a student need to be successful in that? And what can we do to have that in place prior to the student beginning CTE? The student applies to the center. That's step 6. The CTE center receives and reviews the applications. So I'm not going to read every little slide, but basically, the most important part I want to convey to you is this upfront work, so that the CTE center has everything that they need to consider the student, which is, again, blind of any type of disability information. So that's what makes this process a little bit tricky and nuanced. So the IEP team does the vetting of any of the nuances and implications for how that student's disability might impact them on the CTE program. And if in light of that, everything feels like it's still going to be a good fit, and the team thinks that the student is going to be successful, then the student would go and apply. If the IEP team feels like this is too much of a stretch at this point and it might not be a good fit, then the IEP team should be considering some other options, like bring it back to those post-secondary goals. What is the student hoping to achieve after they graduate? Okay, and what are those most critical skills needed? and then start putting together and using that information to put together a potential program, whether it's extended learning opportunities or work-based learning or other options. And there are some other transition providers as well. And CTE, like I said at the beginning of this, CTE has some issues in the sort of the systems that we want to be addressing. We know we need to address them, but we're also in a situation where there's a redistricting happening statewide, and then we also have statewide graduation requirements that are going to be coming down. So we have some ideas, and we have received feedback over the years about the overall system for this. And then secondarily, we would like to start to develop a separate pathway that is more of like an occupational development type program. And I'm going to get to that. But for now, nothing has changed. So this is why we're still reviewing the existing guidance for CTE. And keeping in mind that CTE has many, many, many students on IEPs that are very successful. So it's just, depending on the nature of the disability and their needs, and having the team kind of overlay that with the requirements and the day-to-day rigor and expectations and safety and things like that to make an informed decision. All right, some common pitfalls that tend to happen around the state. If the IEP team does not review the rigor of the program, but yet recommends that the student applies, this is a common pitfall and can bring forth heartbreaking situations where the student, due to the nature of their disability, cannot remain safe in the CTE setting and needs to be removed after several months in the program. We want IEP teams to fully vet the CTE program and make sure it's in the student's best interest. In the past, CTE programs did not always have clear information about the rigor of their programs, but for the most part, this has been addressed, and they are using their websites to list out those requirements. Also, don't forget that the special needs coordinator, like I said, can be your biggest asset. One other thing I wanted to mention, just in terms of the systems area that we are aware of, we realize that there are many CTE teachers that are true experts in their industry, but could benefit from more training around universal design for learning, disability awareness, making reasonable accommodations. And we know that is something we need to do as a state. And so that is also something we have on our radar to amplify that and work through that in sort of this next chapter of CTE. But for now, it's really the IEP team needs to go through these things prior to the application. I just wonder if we should, whoops, I lost. Wonder if we should address a couple questions.
Sure, we can do that. It looks like Carrie has her hand raised. Carrie, would you like to unmute and go ahead?
Hi, John. Thank you. In looking at that first bullet that you just talked about, as far as the situation where a student, by the nature of their disability, can't remain safe in the CET process, can you talk about how that interplays with a manifestation process around protections that kids with disabilities have related to discipline and removal?
Yes, it is a tricky subject, but the flowchart actually does address that. But basically, the sending LEA, the home LEA would do the manifestation determination with the center. And one thing it might do is it might point out other areas that the sending school IEP team needs to be considering prior to the placement in CTE. But the thing is, CTE sort of has these hard, fast rules around safety, like depending on the industry. So if there was something that was, so it's difficult to say whether or not a manifestation is going to allow that student to continue or not. It's going to depend on, will the manifestation sort of bring forth some additional supports that would prevent that safety situation? Or are we just going to take this new knowledge that we've gathered about the process and use that going forward for other students coming into the program. But the sending LEA would do that manifestation. And let me pull up the flow chart again. See, I share my screen. Yeah, I don't think I'm okay. So let me just see if I can read the part about the manifestation. So the sending LEA is ultimately responsible for implementation and maintenance of the IEP. The LEA can negotiate. Okay, that's not the slide we want. I feel like we had something about the manifestations on this page, and I'm just not seeing it for the moment. Okay, if specific safety concerns arise because of a student's behavior in class that poses a direct threat to the health or safety of others, the center does not have to allow the student to participate in the course. Individualized assessment must be conducted by a qualified professional in order for this decision to be made. Manifestation should be conducted by the sending LEA. Does that answer your question, Carrie?
It does, but it doesn't, because if I think about your bullet, it said if a student is removed due to their disability for safety reason, it just feels a little discriminatory that a public entity could remove a kid for something due to their disability without going through the proper due process channels of manifestation and pieces like that. Because what you just said talked about the fact that they could just have some sort of independent review done by an administrator to say they're not in there. I worry about how that could transpire to other forms of public ed. Like, can a science teacher now say that about a chemistry class?
No. Yeah, I mean, because CTE is more on kind of like the ADA side of things, they kind of have their own rules for safety. Now, the manifestation might still allow that student to continue based on what comes out of that. So maybe my slide needs to be sort of rephrased a little bit, but basically, at that point, the manifestation would clarify whether or not the student really needs to be removed. Yeah, I mean, because they have like extreme situations in CTE, like with all of the tools and the heavy equipment, and there's there's a lot of dangerous stuff that they have to do depending on which program they're in. So that's why they're really pretty strict around safety.
So
First,
John,
go ahead.
sorry, this is Jean. I'm sitting here in the corner over here. This is my hand. I don't know how much you can see of me, but I just want to, sorry to sort of belabor this point, but I'd love a response to this. So when you're talking about manifestations in relationship to our tech centers, whichever one that you're talking about, right? The manifestation team isn't making the decision about the placement in tech, right? So I just want to go back to this point that you were making, right? So what we're doing, right, is making a decision about whether it's a yes or a no related to the manifestation. And so I think this is important to come back to, because it goes back to what Carrie was saying, which is this idea that I, as the LEA, along with the IEP team, can sit and we can make a decision that it is related to their disability. Boom, manifestation's done. And then the tech center can say, and you're still not allowed here, right? So they are essentially separate discussions, which does bring back validity to that question that Carrie was sort of asking. And I think this is, sort of the conversation that's an interesting conversation around students with disabilities enrolled in our tech centers, related to sort of the power of an IEP team, when the IEP team is saying, yeah, that was related to their disability, and now let's, you know, have a conversation about appropriate accommodations.
Yeah, the IEP team should, if the IEP team has a student that maybe has some self-regulation challenges or has some concerns about that, prior to applying, should bring this up with the special needs coordinator. Again, not identifying any student or name at that stage, and just ask, well, how does the center handle that? Is it a hard and fast rule? You know, if they do something very dangerous, they're going to be removed. And is that, you know, where is that documented clearly so that the teams know that, so that there's no surprises here? Or is it a situation where they will consider kind of what you're saying, Gene, where the manifestation is showing that this is due to the student's disability, and can we put some supports in place to see if we can make this work? That's going to be case by case and dependent on the center and the CTE director and their overall program and how they operate. So I can't go too deep into this because I can't really speak to it as well because it's going to depend on the CTE center. If there are any CTE directors here on this call or any special needs coordinators that would like to speak to this, that would be great. Does that, I mean, if there is anybody. But like I said, Gene, I don't have, I can't go too deep into this per se because I think it's going to vary by the individual situation and whether or not the CTE center is willing to try an additional sort of solution that might come out of that manifestation.
Yeah,
Uh,
and John, thank you for allowing me to just push back a little bit. I always appreciate you and your ability to do that and allow and create and allow space for that. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not sure there's a definitive answer. I think I just want to like highlight how challenging that situation is when tech centers are taking that stand, and I think I'm just wanting to elevate that conversation. I'm not sure, and thank you for being so respectful and answering it. I'm not sure that I'm necessarily expecting you to have an answer. I mean, hey, I'd be really excited if you did.
well,
But yeah, thank you.
I appreciate that. And the area to lean into on this is more upfront. So over in this pre-application stage. So if the IEP team knows that the student has some self-regulation challenges and, you know, sometimes has kind of a meltdown, and what they know generally what that might look like, and now they're also considering the program requirements for this CTE program, and let's say they do have some concerns about safety. Well, how do you get that answered? That's where the special needs coordinator can help you identify, well, here's how we generally handle these safety types of issues. You know, and just kind of working through that so that everybody's clear prior to. Like what we don't want to have happen are some of these like major surprises down the road, like all of a sudden everybody realizes this, it's not a good fit and it's like an unsafe situation, and now we have to put together a new program for the student. So trying to pivot that concern to more up on the front end and do a little more front end work as a team is I think, you know, that's really the main messaging that we're trying to impart. Jessica, do you want to go? I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one of the things that I appreciate when I hear you talking is bringing back up what you had kind of stated around how future focus will be on UDL and differentiation, and also potentially like a second option for occupational development. I think those two things are really promising because what I think is maybe a frustration, I want to speak for everybody, is just if there are limits within like how much a tech center can accommodate safety needs, that ultimately like inadvertently kind of like prevents students from being able to access that career development. It's really a hard pill to swallow, I think, for a team that especially is working with a student who really is interested in that career field. And so I think ultimately having some options of how to make something similar accessible and not have it just be an all or nothing will
Yep.
be, I think, helpful. So I just wanted to kind of like kind of just share that and state, I think if those two things truly are on the table for future stuff, that might be really helpful.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, like personally, over the years, I've been at AOE for 20 years. I mean, I helped design this guidance. This is over probably 10 years old almost, and at this point, because like I said, nothing's changed with the current system, but we know we want to have more opportunities and more access for students. And what is that going to look like? And really, we're about to go through all these changes as a state. And so the timing, I think, is going to be good potentially. So that once the redistricting is done, once the statewide grad requirements are done, we potentially can, I think, I'm being hopeful. Okay. This hasn't happened yet. This is wishful thinking. And we are going to touch on this. I have a few slides on this, but to start to start to piece together what this program could look like and have it funded like a collaborative, just like Project Search is funded. So anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. All right, we touched base on this. These are, again, like I said, this slide deck's going to go out. So these three links are the existing guidance that mostly I've pretty much summarized up to this point. But you can look through those. Those will be live links in the slide deck. All right, so these are some other programs that do a really good job with transition skills. I'm a huge fan of all of these programs, and of course, we want to see more, right? All right, so let's just try to summarize a couple things. So we have the UVM Medical Center Project Search, and we have the Dartmouth Hitchcock Project Search, and we used to have the Rutland Hospital Project Search. The problem is the Rutland Hospital Project Search didn't get enough students to make it work. And Project Search is a sustainable funding model. So if there's not enough students coming in from the surrounding districts that are getting tuitioned in, the whole project can't really stay afloat. So surprisingly, I helped get Rutland going. I helped get UVM Medical Center going. And one of the main things that we had to consider was, is there going to be enough potential students? So we had to kind of do some forecasting of how many students are kind of coming through the system that, might be a good fit. So the UVM Project Search has been absolutely cranking. It's amazing. It's for students, and same goes for Dartmouth Hitchcock, which is the original Project Search in our region, really sort of between Vermont and New Hampshire. They were the first, and then the UVM Medical Center one was actually the second. But at that time, we held it at the Edge Sports and Fitness, because at the time UVM Medical Center said no to us, and I gotta try to mute. Anyway. So Project Search is like a workplace immersion program for kids in their final year of high school. So once your student has met their course requirements for graduation, the IEP team can decide to have them come back and have a year. So they have not graduated yet and have a year focused on employment training. And Project Search has a unique model where students, are sort of expected to use public transportation where possible to get themselves to the hospital. It's kind of based on this concept that a hospital is a microcosm of a community, in that you have lots and lots of different options for job skill training and internships. And the really cool thing about Project Search is that it's almost like true employment inclusion. So once that student has been trained on that, the task that they're doing as their part of their internship, and they do 3 internships in the school year. Once they're trained, that job coach starts to fade, and the student eventually is supervised by the department head at the hospital, which is really cool. It's not like they're supervised by a para. or a teacher or they're like immersed into the program. They're onboarded, they're a part of the hospital, and the skills that those students getting is incredible. College Staffs is another really cool option, and they do have quite a few locations now, but they are at our Vermont State University locations, and they have transition programming for kids prior to graduation. And then they also have a 2-year program for once a student has graduated. And it has a very heavy employment training component to it as well. The ODP program, the Occupational Development Program of the Springfield Area Regional Collaborative, this is a current program that is still going on, and it's really amazing. Students are, part of that are part of the program are mainstreamed in certain courses, and then they have the ODP program is kind of their core programming, and they're having work-based learning, internships, soft and hard skill training around employment, as well as, like I said, the mainstreaming aspect for certain courses. And what we're going to be doing is kind of drafting up the ODP model. And this is going to have to come after the redistricting process that we're going to go through as a state. But we want to sort of bring this out as a model and see if we can start to get regions of the state to start to incorporate it. And this is also where, students that maybe have some developmental disabilities, and maybe the IEP team has determined that the traditional CTE track is probably not going to fit for that potential student. If that happens, this would be another option eventually, hopefully. It is an option in the Springfield region, and it's a collaborative, so the surrounding districts can utilize it a lot like Project Search. So that is exciting. We want to bring that back. There used to be a lot more ODP programs, and I'm not totally sure why they went away, but some things come full circle, and this is one that I think is going to be coming full circle. So again, this is something that, as far as the new version of what this might look like in terms of scaling it up statewide, we need to go through our process, right? There needs to be vetting. We need to have key stakeholders weigh in on, like, for example, VCSEA, or Vermont Council of Special Ed Administrators. We always like to have those folks weigh in on some of these new initiatives so that they can sort of help us think through what this is actually going to look like. Think College is at UVM and has some options prior to graduation, as well as the 2-year program, just like similar to College Steps, where they are taking courses. They get a peer mentor. College Steps does that as well. They utilize the peer mentor model, where they have a typically matriculating student at that college that wants to be a part of this. And it's typically students that are interested in human services or education, perhaps a future teacher. And they do peer mentoring with students that are a part of their program. These are high school graduates at that point, as far as that model. But like I said, they do have some transition programming prior to graduation. And actually, I think they do still utilize the peer mentor model for that too. Howard Center Succeed program has been around for a long time, is very well respected. This again is for after high school graduation, and students have a residential component, so the daily living skills that they get. It's a very supportive atmosphere. A lot of success happens for a lot of those students. It's a very highly regarded program. So it's more going to be appropriate for the young adults that are in the Chittenden County area, just in terms of logistically, getting to that program. The Belkate Works, I just like to throw them in there because they are doing some super innovative work. The Belkate School is an independent school, but they have spent a lot of time developing sort of like a 3-level employment training program, where they have sort of like the base level of learning soft skills, around communication related to employment. And then they have an on-site professional sort of kitchen, really, and they're making these dog treats, and it's sort of a business, and the students are involved in all aspects of the business. So it's kind of workplace immersion, work-based learning, and they're also very, very skilled at independent living skill development. So just another great option, but again, that's kind of Chittenden County based. So that's why we really want to try to get scale up the ODP model statewide so that we can kind of get some more good transition skill development options statewide. The other aspect, and this is something that is statewide, is as an IEP team, it's really important for you to be connected and understand what is available for work-based learning and extended learning opportunities where there's some flexible pathways around achieving their graduation requirements. So some high schools have their own work-based learning coordinator. And if you're a part of an IEP team, there's no reason you can't be connecting with that person almost in the same way when we're talking about considering the rigor of CTE. You can be connecting with that work-based learning person and seeing what options might exist for your student and how that might be built into that student's program. And then, of course, it needs to be aligned with the IEP, which we're going to get to.
John, just giving you a 15-minute
Okay,
time.
I'll pick up the pace a little bit. Thank you. Real quick. So for any of these programs, whether it's CTE, Project Search, ODP, whatever it is, for this employment training program, the IEP should be, once a student is accepted into the program or is started an official, internship, the IEP should reflect that accordingly. And it should be very aligned. Like, so those post-secondary goals, which are really these outcomes that take place after graduation, what are the critical skills that student needs? Okay. And those skills should be developed by those annual IEP goals in the transition plan. And we want, whether it's CTE, ODP, Project Search, we want those annual goals, that the skill development aspect of those goals to be, that the students should be able to work on those while they are at CTE or while they're at work-based learning, while they're in Project Search. So it should be aligned. Okay. And I think sometimes there's situations where that's not always happening. And so, if let's say you're a special educator on this call, or you're a special ed director, and you have some students going into some different kinds of programs, and you want to make sure the IEP is aligned, just reach out to me and I can kind of walk you through some of the concepts if you need any technical assistance around that. It's always going to come back to that skill development. So in light of that student's disability, and in light of what they hope to do after they graduate, how does that disability impact them? What are the most critical skills that they need? Don't forget to use the Vermont Graduation Readiness Tool. We recommend that IEP teams start using that in 9th grade and then just review it at each annual IEP meeting, just so you can be sort of forecasting. These are some things that are coming down the pipeline. These are some things we want to be considering, and it's all about access. Okay. The readiness tool helps you determine as a team, has our student had access to the transition services that they need to be successful? And that tool helps teams think through, has this student had the access? And that tool has been updated. So make sure you're looking at the one that is from December of 2024. And that's what that particular link is. All right. Why is this all important? I kind of already sort of said this, but, you want to take into account how their disability is going to impact their future employment, future education and training, and future independent living. And you want to have those annual goals in that IEP directly building those skills that are going to help them meet their post-secondary goals, which are those outcomes that take place after high school. These are just general questions for the IEP team as they're thinking about with the IEP transition plan and making sure it's aligned. What skills do they need? And these are some common transition skills that we see built with annual IEP goals: self-advocacy skills, public transportation skills, decision-making skills, communication skills, reading comprehension skills, writing skills, math skills, finance and money skills, self-care skills. So some of them might overlap into the other part of the IEP, which is fine. You can bring over, if you have let's say a math goal that is a critical aspect to that student's future, you can bring that over to the transition plan. There's nothing wrong with having it over there and also in the transition plan if needed. And remember that these are career-based goals. They're functional. So, you want to have phrasing like, in order to be successful in future employment, the student will do XYZ with this level of, proficiency by this date. So they're still written out as a SMART goal. But some of them might overlap into the other goals that you have, and then some others might be more related to soft skills related to employment or communication, self-advocacy, or public transportation and things like that. So again, it's going to depend on what your transition assessments have determined to be around those post-secondary goals, those outcomes. And then you work on the skill development, and then you're writing those annual goals. I know we're going kind of fast. These are just the 8 requirements for the transition plan. These are some other transition plan resources. These are actually recorded trainings on different parts of the transition plan. And then this document, the master resource, is just a huge document that has lots of examples for the transition plan. This was designed for high school special educators to get the resources they need. Note to parents, I know I got to pick up the pace here. I think just in my history of my own brothers, so I'm wearing 2 hats right now as a sibling and as a legal guardian and as an AOE staff. And even when you have all the right team members around, you might find as a parent that you still have to do some job development, meaning you still might have to help kind of that student find that work experience or that first job, or and to work some of the connections. So if you have a family friend or some kind of connection to this business that your son or daughter really wants to try out or utilize as a work placement, maybe even some paid employment, leverage those existing relationships and connections. And sometimes those are the best anyway, because that person might know your son or daughter, and that sort of creates a safer space for them in a sense to be learning and garnering these skills in a safe space. Stay connected to higher ability. Okay. The main reason is they are going to be in your son or daughter's corner after they graduate. So, when your son or daughter graduates from high school, they're going to leave the protections and the entitlements of special education, and they're going to be out in this other world of eligibility. And at least you can have higher ability in their corner. That's why we want to make those connections prior to graduation. Wish list for future programs. We would love to get a project search going in Central Vermont, either through Copley Hospital or Central Vermont Hospital. And then, of course, we want to get this alternate CTE pathway focused on skill development and kind of build that into an occupational development program. So that's the wish list. We don't have it yet, but we want to go there. Question from the field. We pretty much covered this one. I want to make sure I cover this real quick. So you may have heard that Vermont is pivoting to do statewide graduation requirements where every high school has the same required credits for graduation. Okay. We're also going to remain a state that does one diploma for all students. We're not going to become a state that does a separate diploma for students on an IEP. We know that's unethical, and we know the outcomes are not as good when that happens. So we're going to have one diploma for all students, and we're going to create an accessibility system for each graduation requirement. The early thinking is that we would have standards, proficiency scales attached to each requirement. And due to the nature of a student's disability, if they need a modified requirement, the IEP team and the school counselor can help set that up. And we're going to have a system that is all built. So special educators are not going to have to reinvent the wheel. We're going to have the goal is to have a complete system by the time that this entire system is enacted. And we are in the process of creating a accessibility work group for this that includes principals, school counselors, special ed directors, VCSEA, modifications experts from the I team and CDCI, gen ed folks, and PLP folks as well. And again, to create a comprehensive system for that will allow all students to access the same graduation requirements. All right, I think a few minutes here. So what do we have for?
You did great, John. Thank you so much. It's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Before we get to any other questions folks might have, we're going to just drop the evaluation into the chat and ask everyone to just take a moment and fill that out for us. It's super helpful for our presenters and for our staff, and then it's also a grant requirement. So we'll just pause for a moment while people do that for us, and then we'll go to any questions. Okay. If anyone has any questions for John, you can raise your virtual hand or enter them in the chat. And you're getting a round of applause.
Thanks, Matt.
I do have a question though. I think I hit the
Yeah,
wrong.
go ahead.
So there's the raise the hand button. My bad. So I've been in contact with Krista and a couple other people, Alexis, with Higher Ability. And the thought is to put together a special ed transition night here at Otter Valley, where we take VFN, Higher Ability, incorporate P2P, Stafford, Hannaford, College Steps, all those, bring them together one night, talk about what's accessible to them. But one of the biggest components I'd like to have is someone come and speak about guardianship. Do you have anyone you recommend that I could reach out to that would be willing to do that?
Well, the first person that comes to mind would be Kirsten, who is the head of our Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm just randomly
Kristen
drawing a blank.
Murphy.
Yeah, Kirsten Murphy.
Mhm.
And also, Matt, you should know that along with the DD Council, I'm also on that, and I worked with Kirsten and the council, and we created supported decision-making guidance.
Okay.
I could probably quickly put that link in the chat, and it's a guidance document that's kind of designed for educators to try to understand what this is. And real quick, what it is when a student with a disability that is in a situation where the parent wants to apply for guardianship, or so that does happen, right? They apply for guardianship, it is what it is, and then it moves on to the next stages. However, there is an alternative called supported decision making. And instead of that parent applying for guardianship, they would create a supported decision-making arrangement. And what that means is that young adult would get to choose who's going to help them make decisions around money, who's going to help them make decisions around education, their home living arrangement. Like there's a whole category of areas that they can decide, they can choose to who's going to be their support network, and they kind of build it into this agreement. And the outcomes are really pretty good on it because they have more authority and sort of more self-actualization sort of with it in terms of they're their own guardian, but they have really designated and clear supports built in terms of how they'll handle it, versus guardianship where the parent has the guardianship. And it's not like one is right and one's not right. It's like what's right for the family and the person. So I'm gonna try to quickly before we go put the
Yeah, it looks like Krista put in the Green Mountain Self-Advocate one. Is that
Yeah, that's a different one. I'm going to put the education one we have on our AOE site. I'm going to just quickly grab the link. I'm almost there. And so just kind of be familiar with that. But Kirsten would be kind of the person to start with. And she might even have somebody that is even more specific that could be what you're looking for too. So,
Okay.
but let me just get this document in where it is. There it is. Okay, I got it. I'm going to put it right in the chat here. So that took a couple years to get into place because Vermont was kind of new to this. And so we wanted to create something just so educators had some understanding of what this is, because we've never really done this in Vermont, as far as this alternative to guardianship. And like I said, it's up to the family, but it's
Right.
good for educators to kind of know that this does exist.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Any other questions?
John, one thing I was thinking about, I really appreciated what you said about the IEP team and also families being really proactive in thinking about ways to help that young person identify their skills and their interests and then identifying opportunities that might be a good fit for them. And I'm wondering what opportunities folks have to do that exploration in middle school. So some CTE programs you can even take advantage of in 9th or 10th grade, but it might be helpful to have those conversations even before then. And I'm just wondering what you know about
I
that.
love the idea. I'm not sure the level that it's happening, but for 7th and 8th graders, my understanding is they're supposed to have PLPs, the personalized learning plans.
Mhm.
And it sounds like not all schools have implemented that. Um, and not all of our students on IEPs have had access to that. And that's another area we want to address in this sort of next chapter of Vermont education. But yeah, having PLPs in middle school, that 7th and 8th grade, that those PLPs really kind of get into, career interests, things that are, career exploration. Um, that's really the medium for working on those things. And the nice thing is, if you do have a 7th and 8th grader on a PLP and they're on an IEP, and when they get to high school, or at least when they get to the age that they are going to have a transition plan in the IEP, because actually some high schools, even in Vermont now, are starting IEP transition plans earlier than their requirement, and starting them in freshman year. I don't have an exact list of which schools are doing it that way, but the main requirement from the feds is that it starts at age 16. But my point is, prior to that transition plan in the IEP, prior to the first one, if that student had been on a PLP, that PLP has a wealth of information that should be informing the transition plan. And the PLP itself can almost be looked at like a transition assessment because it has all these key components around that student's strengths, needs, and interests. And so you want to pull that information out and use it to build and help support the transition plan in the IEP. But anyway, I'm a big fan of that idea. I just don't know the level of how much it's happening.
Got it. Well, we are at 2:02, so I just want to say thank you so much, John, for offering this workshop for us and for folks in attendance. You'll see some additional resources for Vermont Family Network that you can access. And again, you'll get a link to this recording and the presentation in a follow-up email. So unless there are any other questions, we'll sign off and thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.